Hi, Greg. How are you?
Hey, Alex. I'm good.
Would love to kind of get you very quickly introduced for the audience. If you just say a little bit about yourself, that would be awesome.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Gregg Di Prisco, and I'm the head of business development at the Maker Foundation. The Maker Foundation produces the software that powers MakerDAO, which is the decentralized application that produces DAI, the stablecoin.
Pretty much any functioning economy starts with money, with cash. And from my point of view, and others argue as well, Maker has become that foundation for kind of stable coins alongside the kind of fiat-backed currencies as well. So I'd love to kind of get you to explain a little bit about Maker, how it works, how's it different, what are the benefits? Would love to get your insights into that.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say any economy starts with cash, because I would further that statement to say that any economy starts with credit, and that credit usually turns into cash. And the other fiat stablecoins, they allow us to port credit from the legacy economy onto the blockchain. Where MakerDAO is very different is that it actually allows the credit to originate on the blockchain. And that's kind of our primary innovation, is that the entire financial ecosystem is contained in this application.
So what are the pros and cons of this approach versus kind of fiat-backed stablecoins?
Well, with fiat-backed stablecoins, you have basically an unlimited amount of liquidity. You can create and redeem them at will, and there's no limit to how much supply they can have. With something like DAI, its supply is limited by the availability of good collateral and the credit demand on that collateral. And this is the same thing in the real world. It's just done at a much more macro scale. So if you are looking at the decisions that the Federal Reserve is making this week, they're probably looking at the money supply and the available collateral that they have and the credit that can be created against it. It just so happens that they're monitoring this on a global basis, where MakerDAO is monitoring this on a very small scale.
But I guess nowadays, when Maker started, it was a single collateral mechanism. Now it's a multi-collateral. Does that pose risk? Because we knew the amount of ether available, so you knew that the underlying asset could not be inflated by a central issuer. As we go into multi-collateral baskets, that potentially introduces risk, or what's as you evolve Maker? Let's hear your thoughts on that.
Well, so first of all, we started this 5 years ago, and in the original white paper, we said that this has to be a multi-collateral protocol, and this was from lessons that were learned in the past, specifically through a previous token called BitUSD on BitShares. And it turns out actually that adding more collateral is what reduces risk, not adds it. Because when you have one type of collateral, you are exposed to every type of tail risk that you can't imagine. So just to give you a few, with Ether, sure, it has high volatility, and even if you could adjust for that in the parameters in the system, you can't adjust for existential risk like shutting down centralized exchanges or the blockchain malfunctioning. And we are running on Ethereum, so it's a bit different in that context. But the point is that any single type of collateral will have tail risk that you can't anticipate. And the only way to get rid of that tail risk and to make sure that your currency is stable in the long run is to diversify away from any single tail risk to the point where it's basically non-existent.
So remind me, what are the assets today that you can use to collateralize Maker?
Yeah, and keep in mind, today is still we are on, if you're looking at a long river of stepping stones, we are halfway to the first stone. Right now, there's about 7 different assets, I think, that you can generate DAI against, but with the exception of other stable coins, almost all of them are very correlated to crypto. So Bitcoin is our second largest after Ether. We use wrapped Bitcoin from Bitgo. Yeah. And then after that, it's other stable coins. And after that, it's a bunch of ERC20 tokens that have a very high correlation with ETH.
So I guess in terms of, what are the other factors that you think is going to make good collateral good? Is it market liquidity, on-chain scalability, connectivity? What are the signs of good collateral going forward?
Well, the first sign of good collateral is demand for credit in the first place.
Yep.
You don't want collateral that nobody wants to borrow against. So once you've eliminated all the ones that people don't care about and you have your list, then I would say it's ones that the legacy economy is not pricing correctly. And this, frankly, was our core competitive advantage with Ether. The legacy economy didn't understand it, and we did, and our more specifically, our community of governance token holders did, and they were able to very competitively price out these DAI facilities against Ether, and that's what led to the initial growth of DAI.
I guess one of the kind of concerns and sometimes issues that people raise about is, with central money, you've got the monetary policy, and the monetary policy is maintained by the Fed or whoever is doing that, depending on your jurisdiction. They get it right, they get it wrong sometimes, but at least you kind of know who's doing that. Who is governing the monetary policy of MakerDAO and many other kind of projects, and how decentralized really is it? Because the accusation is it's not quite as decentralized as a lot of people make it out to be. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, it's quite decentralized. I can tell you that firsthand because a lot of the things that I want to happen don't happen. So,
yep.
That's, by the way, that's the number way you know you're decentralized, when all of your ideas get shut down by your own community. Yep. But beyond that, Maker actually doesn't have its own monetary policy at this point. Because DAI is pegged to the dollar, we piggyback entirely off the Federal Reserve. So you can almost think of us as just an extension of this dollarization that's been happening in the world. In the future, there's always the potential that they could peg DAI to something else. But as long as the dollar remains king, I don't see why anybody would do that. What the Maker holders do, and when I say the Maker holders, in our system, we have this group of token holders called MKR holders. Mm-hmm. And that's why I say it's very decentralized, because I don't think that there's any single holder that has greater than 10% of the supply. And even then, the people that have more than 3%, there might be like 2 or 3 of them. So what they do is they manage the money supply. And in order to do this, they have to basically say, okay, the Fed's policy is this. So we need to meet this dollar mark here. And then what do we do to make sure that our supply is in line and our interest rates are in line to make sure that DAI trades $1? And that's why we say we have a soft peg, not a hard peg. Because there's no point where you can actually redeem DAI for dollars. We're not in the Fed's payment network. But the goal is that through this decentralized governance process, over the long term, DAI will be $1 most of the time.
So I guess that kind of one thing that the community, the Maker community, the Maker token holders can do is decide how much collateral, over collateralization you have. So how does that, who decides, how does that work? Is it 150%? Is it 110%? Is it 200%? Who makes that call?
So the Maker holders make every call on the system. Right. Nothing is delegated to a centralized party. So, and that's part of the scaling challenge, is to make sure that they have the ability to do this when the collateral portfolio is thousands of assets. And because of that, we've introduced something called the Maker improvement proposals. And these are a very rigid framework to follow in order to make these decisions more rapidly and efficiently. But when they're setting that, we like to say that they're following a process called scientific governance and risk. And this is where we really differ from our legacy competitors, where everything we do is out in the open. There's no black box. It's not like you're going to a bank executive and saying, what's in your portfolio? And they say, well, I have a vague idea, but I couldn't possibly tell you the details. With Maker, every single detail is a click away on Etherscan. So it's almost like you can click into the balance sheet of the central bank in one click.
So I'd love to kind of see your evolution of your governance design from the lessons you took out of BitShares and from the lessons you kind of took out of the March stress test, and how you think about going forwards.
Yeah, I was going to say, if March wasn't stressful, then I don't want to be around. And also, I should just clarify. So we didn't, the Maker team never worked on BitShares properly. There was some overlap in the early days with our developers that had previously worked on BitShares. Yeah. But I think a lot of the original team members of Maker were strong BitShares community members. And in DAO world, it's hard to differentiate between a core team member and a community member sometimes. So I just wanted to put that out there. But Yeah, one of the core lessons, at least that I learned from BitUSD, is you need two things. You need a strong business community around your product. You can't just assume people are going to use it. And you need to diversify into multiple sources of collateral, because having one, and back in those days, it was just BitShares was the only collateral. You simply can't account for all the risk. And if you can't account for all the risk, the only way to protect yourself is through diversification. So the two takeaways from BitUSD for me were multiple forms of collateral, as many as possible, and also a strong business community around your product, where you cannot just build technology and assume people are going to use it. You have to help them.
Gotcha. And then what are the lessons from the stress test? Because a lot of the time people are saying kind of people couldn't meet margin calls, the oracles didn't quite perform. What are the takeaways, and what are your roadmap items on the back of the
yeah, well, so the very specific takeaways from that stress test were the auction parameters needed to be updated, because even though a lot of the issues were with the Ethereum network, they were because of a very short auction time frame.
Gotcha.
And if the auction time frame was longer, it probably would have played out differently. But the long-term lessons from that were a complete reaffirmation of our vision, which is that you need multiple collateral types, and B, the idea that governance is just as important as we always said it was. Where if you had an active governance community, and something really interesting that happened with March 12th is before that, governance was kind of, I don't want to say dead, but it was quiet. People were just going through the motions. There was very few participants. Since then, we have had an exponential growth in our governance community. People really care now because they saw that their input matters. And I think when you show somebody that their input matters, they're much more likely to participate.
Cool. No, that's I think that's really good to understand. So I guess moving on to a little bit about, one of the things which I personally really love about DeFi is the ability to kind of modularize finance and then plug it together.
Money Legos.
yeah, exactly that. But of course, that kind of comes back to the old problem we have in centralized finance of hypothecation, re-hypothecation, re-hypothecation, and then you lose track. So, you take your Bitcoin, you wrap it. Once you wrap it, you use it as collateral and DAI. Then you take your DAI and you put it as collateral into compound finance. So you get CDAI, and then you use CDAI to create a derivative product on UMA project or something else. I mean, gosh, how many risk factors do you combine in one? How the hell do you understand all the kind of attack vectors and risk vectors and all that? So I'd love to hear your thoughts about kind of how can we have this modularity, which is really great, but also how can we reduce the risks so that we don't, go back to the 2007 financial crisis, just reinvented on blockchain.
Yeah, and this is where we have to get a little bit philosophical in that if you look back to the great financial crisis, I think it really separates into two camps of people that, where to point the fingers. You have people who think that it was the complexity of the products that were the problem, and people who think it was the opacity of the products that were the problem. I firmly fall in the latter camp. I don't think that complexity in and of itself is a bad thing. Complexity is only bad when it's hidden.
Yep.
So the problem with the great financial crisis is that you had a mortgage-backed security and you had no idea what was inside of it. If anybody could have gone on, let's say, Etherscan and clicked into that mortgage-backed security and said, oh, here are these specific mortgages backing this, I can tell that 10% of these are actually worth what they say they're worth, then it was a lot easier to blow the whistle on there being a problem. So for me, the fact that in DeFi, everything is by default transparent to almost, to its core, that to me makes the big difference.
So I guess kind of double back on the previous point that you got the end users of the DAI, mostly retail right now, but the kind of the credit side is institutional. So what do you think needs to happen? What are the key barriers to break down for institutionals to come into this space?
We have to, and when I say we, I mean the entire maker community needs to make our products work in a way that they can use without too much of a difference between what they do today. I think something nice that I heard once was you should never ask somebody to do something that's more than one standard deviation outside of their comfort zone.
Yep.
So if using MetaMask is one standard deviation outside of your comfort zone, we can't ask you to do anything else. So, you know, we have to bring the usability level to where it meets them in the middle, not us. I think a lot of blockchain right now has been, oh, let's educate them to act like us, where that's not what an executive at a company wants to hear. They're busy, they have a lot to do. They need things to work the way that they're used to working. Otherwise, it's just not worth the cognitive overhead and the risk of doing it.
Thank you so much, Greg, for joining me. Yeah, I wish you success building the amazing product you guys have been building.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you so much.